The most consequential development to emerge from Tehran in recent weeks was not the product of foreign military force, economic sanctions, or diplomatic coercion. It was something far more destabilizing, a fracture from within. On April 22nd, Iran's three most senior civilian officials, President Pezeshkian, Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, and Foreign Minister IRGC, were detained, placed under house arrest, or forcibly removed from their positions. The operation was not carried out by an external adversary. It was executed by Iran's own Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. The IRGC had staged a coup against its own government. The full extent of this power seizure became unmistakably clear the following morning, on April 23rd, when all three officials posted identical messages to their respective social media accounts, word for word, within minutes of one another. Three constitutionally independent political figures, operating from separate offices with separate staffs and separate political mandates, produced a single uniform text. This was not three men speaking. This was one hand holding three phones. That hand belongs to IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi. To fully appreciate the significance of what Vahidi has set in motion, one must understand what the IRGC actually represents within the Iranian state. Characterizing it simply as a military organization is a fundamental misreading of its role. The IRGC is simultaneously Iran's largest armed force, its most powerful economic actor, its primary intelligence apparatus, and its ideological guardian. Its construction conglomerate, Khatam al-Anbiya, holds contracts worth tens of billions of dollars across Iran's infrastructure, telecommunications, petrochemical, and banking sectors. The IRGC does not merely defend the Islamic Republic, it owns significant portions of it. This economic empire is central to understanding every decision Vahidi has made since assuming command on March 1st. For the IRGC, peace is not merely ideologically unacceptable. It is existentially threatening. In wartime, the IRGC is indispensable. Budgets expand, political influence grows, construction contracts multiply. Intelligence operations proceed with minimal civilian oversight, justified by emergency conditions. Every dimension of IRGC power is amplified by conflict. In peacetime, inconvenient questions surface. Why does a military organization control civilian construction contracts? Why does it operate telecommunications infrastructure? Why does its budget consume a disproportionate share of national revenue while public services deteriorate? These are questions that a functioning civilian government can force into public discourse, and questions that a negotiated resolution to the current conflict would make impossible to suppress. Vahidi's objective is not military victory. It is the perpetuation of the conditions, permanent conflict, or the credible threat thereof, that justify IRGC dominance until no civilian institution retains sufficient authority to challenge the Revolutionary Guard's monopoly on power. What occurred on April 22nd was not a panic-driven reaction. It was a calculated move executed because the window for acting was closing, and IRGC leadership knew it. The evidence of the civilian leadership's neutralization arrived in stages. Ghalibaf's removal from the negotiation process was publicly framed as a resignation, but the timing demolishes that narrative entirely. The day the IRGC sabotaged the Islamabad talks was the same day Ghalibaf was removed. He was not stepping back from negotiations that had collapsed. He was removed from negotiations that the IRGC was simultaneously engineering to collapse. This is particularly significant given Ghalibaf's background. He's a product of the Revolutionary Guard. Raised in its institutions, commanded a corps, built his career within the organization that just sidelined him. His removal was not an ideological purge, it was the elimination of anyone willing to sit at a negotiating table, regardless of their military credentials. Because accepting diplomacy as a path forward is the one position that the IRGC under Vahidi cannot permit. The identical social media posts of April 23rd represent perhaps the most chilling detail in this entire picture. Independent assessments from Iran, international Fox News analysts, and the Institute for the Study of War, ISWC, converged on the same conclusion. Iran's civilian leadership can no longer control its own public communications. The ISWC assessment was unambiguous. Iran's decision-making process remains fragmented and dispersed. Supreme National Security Council Secretary Zolgadar cannot effectively coordinate between the IRGC, civilian leadership, and the Supreme Leader. Overlapping authorities and factional disagreements are preventing the regime from presenting any unified negotiating position. An unnamed American official told Axios on April 22nd that the United States does not know who it is sitting across from at the table. That statement is more consequential than it appears. Washington has structured its entire pressure campaign on the assumption that it is negotiating with an entity capable of making and implementing agreements. If the IRGC has sidelined everyone with the authority to implement an agreement, while keeping civilian faces visible enough to sustain the fiction of a functioning government, then Washington is not conducting diplomacy with Iran. It is conducting diplomacy with the performance of Iran, that the IRGC is running from backstage. The White House recognized this dynamic almost immediately. When news of the collapsed negotiations reached Washington, Vice President Pence, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff spent the day evaluating options alongside President Trump. Intelligence advisors made the assessment explicit. The Iranian negotiating team, including the foreign minister, likely lacks the authority to approve any agreement, even if one is reached. A power seizure attempt is underway under IRGC Commander Vahidi. Trump's public response appeared to offer flexibility. At the request of Oman and Pakistan, he announced an extension of the ceasefire, pending Iran's ability to present a joint proposal. The military blockade, however, would remain. Read that carefully. Trump was not asking Iran to accept American terms. He was asking Iran to demonstrate that it could produce a unified internal position. That is the one thing Vahidi's coup has made impossible. A civilian government that cannot control its own social media accounts cannot produce a joint proposal that the IRGC will subsequently honor. The extension is not a concession. It is rope being extended to a regime that is simultaneously using the other end to tie itself in knots. The decision to pursue economic pressure over bombardment was deliberate and precisely calibrated. The military options exist: B-1 Lancers and B-52s training at RAF Fairford, 3 carrier strike groups positioned in the Gulf. The option was not chosen because waiting is more efficient. Every day the blockade holds, the IRGC's internal contradiction deepens. They need war to justify their power. War kills the economy. The economy's collapse erodes the very power they are fighting to consolidate. They are running on a treadmill that accelerates the harder they run. The economic indicators are stark. Treasury Secretary Bessent's assessment that Cargill storage is reaching capacity within days is not a distant warning. It is an imminent physical reality. When oil wells are forced to shut down because storage is full and exports are blocked, reopening them requires billions of dollars in new investment. Even successfully reopened wells permanently lose 5 to 10% of their production capacity due to reservoir damage sustained during forced shutdown. Iran holds approximately $35 billion in reserves and 180 million barrels of oil circulating in Asia-Pacific markets. Those buffers are real, but finite. 80 to 90% of Iran's economy depends on the flow of goods and energy through its ports. That flow is currently severed. Trump's figures are stark: $500 million in losses per day, military and police personnel not being paid. That last detail carries the most strategic weight. An unpaid security force does not remain a loyal security force. The IRGC's ability to enforce its coup, to maintain house arrests, suppress civilian challenges, and hold its consolidated authority depends entirely on its personnel continuing to execute orders. When those personnel are not receiving salaries, each soldier's decision to comply becomes an economic calculation rather than an ideological one. An unpaid IRGC is not a loyal IRGC, and an IRGC that cannot pay its soldiers cannot sustain the consolidation of power it has just attempted. The regime's response to this trap bears the unmistakable hallmarks of an actor running out of rational options. On April 22nd, IRGC soldiers stood atop a Khorramshahr 4 ballistic missile displayed in Tehran's Revolution Square. The missile carries a 2,000-kilometer range, capable of reaching Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and American bases across the Gulf. Its placement in a public square was not a military operation. It was a message. We control the weapons. We are not interested in negotiations. The table has been flipped. That same day, the IRGC attacked 3 vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and seized 2, one Greek, one UAE-based, one Swiss-based. None of these nations are parties to the conflict. Several had actively worked to keep their territory and airspace off limits to American operations against Iran. Iran is now seizing the ships of countries that are not fighting against it, threatening civilian populations with no stake in the war, and warning citizens to leave Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait immediately. These are Sunni majority nations that specifically refuse to support American offensive operations against Iran. Iran is threatening them for one reason. They are the only targets Iran can reach. Without triggering a response, it cannot survive. As General Petraeus observed, 17% of Qatar's LNG capacity will be offline for 3 to 5 years from infrastructure damage already sustained. Every additional Iranian strike deepens the regional isolation that makes Iran's diplomatic position weaker, not stronger. Iran cannot control its own airspace, its own strait, or its own economy. The only option remaining is to distribute economic pain broadly enough to generate political pressure on Washington, and hope that pressure lifts the blockade before Iran's oil wells shut down permanently. Beneath the military drama and diplomatic collapse lies a third dimension that historical precedent suggests may ultimately prove decisive: the Iranian population. The Gaman Research Institute's independent survey of over 30,000 participants produced findings that contradict every figure broadcast by Iranian state television. 63% of Iranians say this war is between the regime and Israel, not the Iranian people. 44% hold the regime directly responsible for current conditions. 58% rate the regime's performance negatively. The protests that have been building since the Mahsa Amini movement of 2022 have not subsided. They have accumulated. Each economic shock, each failed war promise, each visible gap between state television's narrative and the reality of fuel shortages in an oil-producing nation adds to a reservoir of popular anger that has been filling for 4 years. Every major Iranian protest wave in recent history was triggered by a single visible economic event. A stolen election in 2009, a gasoline price spike in 2019, a young woman's death in police custody in 2022. The current conditions are heavier than all three of those triggering moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, diplomatic chaos, an IRGC coup against elected leadership, breadlines, unpaid soldiers, and a supreme leader reportedly in a coma, all converging simultaneously. The chants of "Army, be with the people" rising from Iranian streets are not empty expressions of discontent. They are direct communications to the Artesh, Iran's conventional military, whose soldiers are enduring the same economic deterioration as civilians, and whose wounded are reportedly being abandoned by IRGC units refusing to dispatch ambulances. If those appeals find reception within the Artesh command structure, the IRGC's consolidation of power becomes not a strengthening of control, but an acceleration toward the crisis that makes control impossible. The nuclear dimension of Vahidi's total control scenario carries implications extending far beyond Iran's borders. Under civilian leadership, with functioning diplomatic representation, a nuclear agreement addressing Western concerns while preserving some form of Iranian enrichment program remained theoretically accessible. The Islamabad talks, however fragile, provided at least an architectural framework within which such a deal could be constructed. Under full IRGC dominance, that architecture disappears. Vahidi's red lines eliminate the flexibility that civilian negotiators possessed. Under a military regime that has explicitly framed the nuclear program as an existential necessity, and its surrender as ideological capitulation equivalent to the regime's death, the path to a negotiated nuclear resolution closes. The consequences cascade outward. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have each privately communicated to American officials that an Iranian nuclear weapon would compel them to pursue equivalent capability. A Middle East in which 4 or 5 states pursue nuclear weapons simultaneously becomes dramatically more probable under a Vahidi-controlled Iran with no civilian moderating influence and no diplomatic channel capable of producing a credible agreement. Israel's calculus changes in parallel. With civilian negotiators sidelined and the diplomatic path closed, the timeline for Israeli consideration of a preemptive military strike compresses accordingly. Russia and China are observing Iran's internal collapse with the same calculating detachment they have maintained throughout the crisis. Both governments have issued public statements expressing concern about the blockade and affirming Iranian sovereignty. Both governments have simultaneously positioned themselves to benefit from Iranian weakness. Russia has doubled its oil revenues by supplying markets Iran can no longer reach. China has publicly called for Hormuz to remain open as an international waterway, while conducting its own calculations about whether a Vahidi-controlled Iran represents a more or less reliable partner than the civilian military hybrid that preceded it. Military regimes are ideologically more rigid, but operationally more predictable. Russia and China may, in fact, prefer dealing with an IRGC-controlled Iran because the IRGC's institutional interests are more legible than the complex factional negotiations that civilian military hybrid governance requires. A Vahidi-controlled Iran will not produce a nuclear deal. It will not normalize relations with Gulf states. It will not accept any arrangement that diminishes the IRGC's economic empire or political dominance. But it will continue acquiring Chinese technology through whatever networks survive American interdiction. It will continue purchasing Russian weapons through whatever channels remain available. And it will continue providing Moscow and Beijing with the strategic value of an American military commitment in the Gulf that keeps Washington's attention divided between the Middle East and the Pacific. The picture that emerges from this convergence of crises is one that no Western intelligence assessment had fully anticipated at the outset. Iran is no longer analyzable as a state in the traditional sense. It is a powerful paramilitary network that has achieved decisive influence over both armed forces and political institutions, wearing a constitutional architecture as a costume while operating according to the logic of a military faction pursuing institutional self-preservation, regardless of national consequences. At the apex of this structure, a supreme leader reportedly in a coma who may be unaware of the position he now occupies, a president whose real authority is negligible, a foreign minister whose communications may be controlled by the very organization he was appointed to negotiate against, a parliament speaker removed by the military institution he spent his career inside, and Ahmad Vahidi, running a coup from the IRGC command structure, torpedoing diplomatic channels, parading missiles in public squares, threatening neutral Gulf states, and racing against the clock of unpaid soldiers, shutting oil wells, and street anger approaching the threshold where security forces begin calculating their own interests. The IRGC claims to be protecting Iran. In reality, it is holding Iran hostage. Its own people, its own elected officials, its own diplomatic corps, its own economic future. 5 explosions were reported in Tehran within a single minute on the morning of April 23rd. Iranian sources immediately characterized them as routine air defense tests. But coup claims, ceasefire expirations, missile displays in Revolution Square, identical posts from 3 detained officials, and air defense drills, all within the same 24 hours, suggest a regime either preparing for war or sending its own population a message. We are in control. Perhaps both. Trump extended the ceasefire and maintained the blockade. The oil wells are days from mandatory shutdown. The soldiers are not being paid. The IRGC celebrates atop missiles, while citizens wait in bread lines a few streets away. Washington is watching, not because it is hesitating, but because watching costs nothing and waiting is winning. Every day, the IRGC's internal contradiction deepens. Iran's negotiating position weakens further. Every well that shuts down represents permanent damage that no future agreement can fully reverse. Every soldier who calculates that his salary is not coming moves the security architecture one step closer to the threshold where it stops functioning. Washington does not need to break Iran. Iran is breaking itself. The IRGC chose power over survival. In choosing power over survival, it may have chosen neither. The wheels turning in Tehran are shaping the future of everyone from Hormuz to Doha, from Tel Aviv to Beijing, and the regime supposedly steering those wheels can no longer agree on who holds the wheel. That is not a government approaching a deal. That is a regime approaching its own ending. The clock does not care which answer Tehran chooses. It is running regardless.